On the morning of October 3rd, 1984, at approximately 8:15 a.m., FBI Special Agent Richard William Miller walked into the Los Angeles field office carrying a briefcase that contained classified documents he intended to provide to Soviet intelligence officers. What made this moment extraordinary was not the espionage itself. Dead drops and classified leaks were routine elements of Cold War intelligence work. What made it extraordinary was that Miller was an FBI agent. For the first time in the Bureau's 76-year history, one of its own would be arrested for spying for Moscow. Miller, 47 years old, overweight, disheveled, and widely regarded by his colleagues as one of the least competent agents in the Bureau, had been an FBI employee for 20 years. He worked in the Foreign Counterintelligence Squad, the very unit responsible for detecting and preventing Soviet espionage operations in Southern California. The documents in his briefcase that morning included classified information about FBI surveillance techniques, the identities of confidential informants, and details about ongoing counterintelligence investigations targeting Soviet diplomatic personnel. What Miller did not know as he entered the building was that his plan to meet with his Soviet contacts had already been compromised. For the previous 6 weeks, Miller himself had been the target of an intensive FBI internal investigation. His telephone calls had been monitored, his movements had been tracked, and his relationship with a Soviet emigre woman named Svetlana Ogorodnikova, a relationship that included both an affair and a joint espionage venture, had been thoroughly documented. The investigation had been triggered not by sophisticated intelligence analysis or dramatic surveillance breakthroughs, but by something far more mundane: his obvious incompetence, his repeated security violations, his strange behavior, and his colleagues' growing concerns that something was seriously wrong. The case of Richard Miller would force the Bureau to confront uncomfortable questions about its internal security procedures, its personnel management, and its assumption that FBI agents were somehow immune to the temptations and pressures that led other Americans to commit treason. Before we continue with how this impossible betrayal unfolded, if you're interested in the hidden failures and human cost behind Cold War intelligence operations, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We bring you documented cases like this every week, examining the real people behind the classified files. Now, let's look at who Richard Miller was before everything fell apart. Richard William Miller had been born in 1937 in Los Angeles, California. His father worked as a construction supervisor, and his mother was a homemaker. Miller had grown up in a middle-class neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley, attended public schools, and, by all accounts, had been an unremarkable student. After graduating from high school in 1955, he had attended Los Angeles City College for 2 years before dropping out. He had worked a series of jobs, warehouse worker, delivery man, salesman, without particular success or satisfaction. In 1962, at the age of 25, Miller had decided to apply to the FBI. The Bureau in the early 1960s was still led by J. Edgar Hoover, who maintained strict standards for FBI agents regarding appearance, conduct, and personal character. Miller's application materials described him as eager, patriotic, and determined to serve his country in law enforcement. His background investigation had revealed nothing disqualifying: no criminal record, no financial problems, no associations with suspicious individuals or organizations. Miller had been accepted into the FBI training program and had completed the 16-week course at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. His performance during training had been adequate but not exceptional. Instructors noted that he struggled with physical fitness requirements, and appeared to have difficulty with some of the more complex investigative techniques. But he passed all required examinations and was commissioned as a special agent in late 1964. Miller's first assignment had been to the FBI's Los Angeles field office, where he would remain for his entire 20-year career. During his early years with the Bureau, he had worked on a variety of cases: bank robberies, fugitive investigations, organized crime. Supervisors' evaluations from this period described him as a hard-working agent who followed instructions and maintained appropriate professional standards, though they also noted his tendency to be disorganized and his difficulty completing paperwork in a timely manner. In 1967, Miller had married Paula Sorensen, a secretary who worked for a real estate company. Over the following years, the couple would have 4 children. The family lived in a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, and by all external appearances, Miller had achieved the conventional success of a middle-class American family: steady employment with a respected federal agency, a wife and children, a house in a decent neighborhood. But behind this conventional exterior, Miller's life was increasingly characterized by dysfunction and failure. His work performance had declined steadily throughout the 1970s. Supervisors noted in evaluations that his case reports were frequently late, incomplete, or poorly written. He missed meetings and appointments. He failed to follow up on leads. His personal appearance deteriorated. He often came to work disheveled, in wrinkled suits with stains on his clothing. His weight increased significantly. By the early 1980s, he was approximately 250 pounds, far above the FBI's recommended weight standards for his height. Miller's financial situation was also problematic. Despite his FBI salary, which by 1980 was approximately $40,000 per year, a solid middle-class income, he was chronically in debt. He had accumulated credit card balances of more than $20,000. He borrowed money from colleagues and frequently failed to repay loans. His mortgage payments were often late. In 1982, his wife Paula briefly left him, taking the children to her parents' house, though she eventually returned after Miller promised to address his financial and personal problems. In 1982, Miller was reassigned from General Criminal Investigations to the Foreign Counterintelligence Squad. This assignment was unusual. Foreign counterintelligence work typically required agents who were particularly sharp, detail-oriented, and capable of handling sensitive classified information. Miller did not fit this profile. However, the Los Angeles field office needed additional personnel for the counterintelligence squad, and Miller, despite his obvious limitations, was technically qualified for the position. He held the appropriate security clearances. He had been with the Bureau for nearly 20 years. And there was no specific evidence that he was a security risk beyond his general incompetence and disorganization. Miller's assignment to foreign counterintelligence gave him access to classified information about FBI operations targeting Soviet intelligence activities in Southern California. He had access to files identifying Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover, confidential informants who provided information about Soviet activities, surveillance techniques and technologies, and ongoing investigations. This information, if provided to Soviet intelligence, could compromise operations, endanger informants, and allow Soviet officers to evade FBI surveillance. During 1982 and 1983, Miller's work performance in the counterintelligence squad was consistently poor. Supervisors documented numerous problems: missed deadlines, incomplete investigations, failure to attend required meetings, poor communication with other agents. In early 1984, Miller's supervisor recommended that he be placed on administrative leave pending a formal review of his fitness for duty. However, before this recommendation could be implemented, Miller became involved in a situation that would transform his status from merely incompetent to actively treasonous. In May 1984, Miller was assigned to investigate a Soviet emigre couple named Nikolay and Svetlana Ogorodnikov, who lived in Los Angeles and were suspected of maintaining contact with Soviet intelligence officers. Nikolay Ogorodnikov was 51 years old and worked sporadically in various jobs. Svetlana Ogorodnikova was 34 years old, significantly younger than her husband, and worked as a real estate agent. According to FBI records, the Ogorodnikovs had emigrated from the Soviet Union to the United States in 1973. They had applied for and received permission to leave the USSR, which by itself was somewhat unusual and had led FBI counterintelligence analysts to suspect that one or both of them might be maintaining contact with Soviet intelligence as a condition of being allowed to emigrate. The FBI had been conducting sporadic surveillance of the Ogorodnikovs since the late 1970s, but the investigation had been given relatively low priority because there was no clear evidence of active espionage, only suspicions based on their background and occasional contacts with Soviet diplomatic personnel. Miller's assignment was to develop additional information about the Ogorodnikovs' activities and their contacts. Miller first met Svetlana Ogorodnikova in May 1984 when he visited the real estate office where she worked to conduct what was supposed to be a routine interview. Svetlana was an attractive woman with dark hair, expressive features, and what colleagues would later describe as a flirtatious and manipulative personality. Miller, whose marriage was troubled and who had low self-esteem stemming from his professional failures and weight problems, appears to have been immediately attracted to her. What should have been a brief professional interview instead became an extended conversation. According to later testimony, Miller spent more than 2 hours talking with Svetlana that first day. Instead of conducting a formal interrogation focused on gathering information about potential espionage activities, Miller engaged in personal conversation, discussing his unhappiness with his marriage, his financial problems, and his frustrations with the FBI. Svetlana, who according to later evidence was indeed working with Soviet intelligence and who recognized Miller's vulnerabilities, encouraged these confidences and reciprocated with her own stories of dissatisfaction with her marriage and her life in the United States. Over the following weeks, Miller met with Svetlana repeatedly. These meetings were not documented in official FBI reports, nor were they authorized by his supervisors. They met at restaurants, at her apartment when her husband was away, and in Miller's FBI vehicle. By early June 1984, according to later testimony from both Miller and Svetlana, they had begun a sexual relationship. The affair itself was a serious violation of FBI regulations and basic professional conduct. An FBI agent conducting an investigation should never develop a personal relationship with a subject of that investigation, and certainly should never engage in a sexual relationship. Miller was not only violating professional standards, but was also making himself extraordinarily vulnerable to compromise. If Svetlana was indeed connected to Soviet intelligence, which was the very thing Miller was supposed to be investigating, then his relationship with her gave Soviet intelligence enormous leverage over him. What happened next remains somewhat unclear even after extensive investigation, multiple trials, and years of subsequent analysis. According to Miller's later testimony, which was self-serving and which investigators found to be unreliable in many respects, Svetlana had suggested to him in late June 1984 that he could earn significant money by providing information to Soviet intelligence. According to this version of events, Miller claimed that he had seen this as an opportunity to conduct a false flag operation, pretending to agree to spy for the Soviets while actually working to expose Soviet intelligence operations. Investigators found this explanation implausible for several reasons. First, Miller never reported his relationship with Svetlana to any supervisor until after he was confronted with evidence of his espionage activities. Second, FBI procedures require that any agent who is approached by foreign intelligence officers must immediately report the contact and must not engage with those officers except under direct supervision from FBI counterintelligence specialists. Third, Miller's subsequent actions, including his agreement to provide classified information, his acceptance of money, and his efforts to conceal his activities, were entirely inconsistent with a legitimate counterintelligence operation. A more plausible interpretation, based on evidence developed during the investigation, is that Miller, facing financial problems, dissatisfied with his career, attracted to Svetlana, and suffering from poor judgment, agreed to provide information to Soviet intelligence for money, and did so knowing that what he was doing was illegal, although he may have rationalized his actions by telling himself that the information he provided was not particularly sensitive or damaging. In early July 1984, Svetlana arranged for Miller to meet with her husband, Nikolay Ogorodnikov, to discuss the proposed arrangement with Soviet intelligence. According to later testimony, Nikolay explained to Miller that the Ogorodnikovs could serve as intermediaries between Miller and Soviet intelligence officers based at the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. Miller would provide classified information, and in exchange, he would receive money. The amounts discussed were significant: $15,000 immediately and $50,000 more after the information proved valuable. Miller agreed to the arrangement. Over the following weeks, he prepared materials to provide to Soviet intelligence. These materials included classified FBI reports identifying Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in the United States, information about FBI surveillance techniques and technologies, the identities of confidential informants who were providing information to the FBI about Soviet activities, and details about ongoing FBI counterintelligence investigations. Miller's preparation of these materials required him to access classified files, photocopy documents, and remove materials from FBI facilities, all actions that violated security protocols and that should have been noticed by his supervisors or colleagues. However, Miller had been with the FBI for 20 years, was assumed to be trustworthy despite his performance problems, and the FBI's internal security procedures in 1984 were apparently not sufficient to detect his unauthorized activities. On August 7, 1984, Miller and Svetlana drove to San Francisco for what was supposed to be Miller's first meeting with Soviet intelligence officers. The following day, Svetlana went to the Soviet consulate, which was located on Green Street in the Pacific Heights neighborhood. She was inside the consulate for approximately 2 hours. When she returned, she told Miller that Soviet intelligence officers were interested in the information he could provide, but that they wanted to see a sample of what he had access to before making any payment. Miller and Svetlana returned to Los Angeles. Over the following days, Miller prepared what he described as a sample of classified information, a packet of documents that included details about FBI operations and the identities of Soviet intelligence officers who were under FBI surveillance. He gave this packet to Svetlana, who in turn provided it to her husband Nikolay, who, according to the plan, would deliver it to Soviet contacts. What Miller did not know was that by mid-August 1984, the FBI had become aware of his relationship with Svetlana Ogorodnikova and had begun investigating him. The triggering event had been a report from another FBI agent who had happened to see Miller and Svetlana together at a restaurant in Los Angeles. The agent had recognized Svetlana from FBI files as a subject of counterintelligence interest and had been surprised to see her with Miller, who was supposed to be investigating her, not socializing with her. The agent had reported this observation to supervisors. The report had landed on the desk of the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility and the FBI's Internal Security Division. Given Miller's access to classified information and given that Svetlana was suspected of having ties to Soviet intelligence, the sighting of them together was immediately recognized as a potentially serious security problem. A decision was made to open an internal investigation of Miller. The investigation began in mid-August 1984. FBI agents were assigned to conduct surveillance of Miller, monitor his activities, and determine whether he was engaged in unauthorized contact with Svetlana Ogorodnikova and whether any classified information had been compromised. The investigation was conducted with extraordinary secrecy. Only a small number of senior FBI officials were informed. Miller's immediate supervisors were not told, as there was concern that warning Miller might cause him to destroy evidence or to cease his activities before the full extent of his actions could be determined. Over the following 6 weeks, FBI investigators documented extensive contact between Miller and Svetlana Ogorodnikova. They photographed them meeting at restaurants, at her apartment, and in Miller's FBI vehicle. They obtained authorization for a wiretap on Svetlana's telephone and recorded conversations in which she and Miller discussed plans for additional meetings and for providing more information. They followed Miller as he accessed classified files at FBI offices. They documented him photocopying materials and removing them from the building. The investigation also revealed the extent of the Ogorodnikovs' connections to Soviet intelligence. Surveillance documented Nikolay Ogorodnikov making multiple trips to the Soviet consulate in San Francisco. Wiretaps revealed conversations between Svetlana and Nikolay in which they discussed "our friends," a term investigators believed referred to Soviet intelligence officers, and mentioned meetings and exchanges of information. Analysis of the Ogorodnikovs' financial records showed unexplained deposits totaling approximately $10,000 during the period of Miller's relationship with Svetlana, suggesting that Soviet intelligence may have been providing money to the Ogorodnikovs to facilitate their recruitment of Miller. By late September 1984, FBI investigators had accumulated sufficient evidence to conclude that Miller had been providing classified information to Soviet intelligence through the Ogorodnikovs. The question became when and how to make arrests. Investigators wanted to document as much of Miller's activities as possible in order to build the strongest possible case, but they also recognized that every day Miller remained at the FBI with access to classified information represented a continuing security risk. The decision was made to arrest Miller on October 3, 1984. Early that morning, before Miller arrived at the FBI's Los Angeles field office, a team of FBI agents and officials from the Office of Professional Responsibility positioned themselves in the building. When Miller arrived, he was met by his supervisor and by 2 agents from the Internal Security Division. He was told that he was being placed on administrative leave and that his security clearances were being suspended pending an investigation. He was escorted to a conference room. Miller's initial reaction, according to the agents present, was one of shock and denial. He asked what he was being accused of and insisted that he had done nothing wrong. He was told that the FBI had evidence of his unauthorized contact with Svetlana Ogorodnikova and that he was suspected of providing classified information to individuals with ties to Soviet intelligence. Miller insisted that his relationship with Svetlana had been part of an authorized counterintelligence operation, though he offered no credible explanation for why he had never reported his activities to any supervisor and could not provide any documentation of authorization. After several hours of questioning, during which Miller's explanations became increasingly contradictory and implausible, he was formally arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. The arrest was made at approximately 2:30 p.m. on October 3rd, 1984. Miller was handcuffed, read his rights, and transported to the federal courthouse in Los Angeles for initial appearance before a magistrate. Later that same day, FBI agents arrested Svetlana and Nikolay Ogorodnikov at their apartment in Los Angeles. Both were charged with espionage-related offenses. According to arrest reports, Svetlana appeared defiant, insisting that she had done nothing illegal and that Miller had been the one who initiated contact and offered to provide information. Nikolay appeared frightened and confused, claiming that he had merely followed his wife's instructions and had not understood the significance of the documents he had been asked to deliver. The arrests of an FBI agent and 2 Soviet emigres on espionage charges were unprecedented and immediately attracted enormous media attention. The FBI issued a brief statement acknowledging the arrests and stating that the investigation had revealed unauthorized disclosure of classified information to individuals with ties to foreign intelligence services. News organizations ran front-page stories with headlines describing the arrest of an FBI agent accused of spying for the Soviet Union, a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. Miller's wife, Paula, was informed of her husband's arrest by FBI agents who came to the family's home late on the afternoon of October 3rd. According to agents who were present, Paula's reaction was one of complete disbelief. She insisted that her husband, despite his many flaws and problems, would never betray his country or the FBI. When agents explained the evidence against him, including his affair with Svetlana Ogorodnikova, Paula became distraught and angry, though whether her anger was directed primarily at her husband's betrayal of his marriage vows or his betrayal of his professional responsibilities was unclear. The Miller children were at school when their father was arrested. When they came home that afternoon, their mother had to explain to them that their father had been arrested and charged with very serious crimes. According to later interviews, the children had difficulty understanding what espionage meant and why their father was being accused of it. The 2 older children had some awareness from television and movies that spying was something bad, but they could not reconcile this abstract concept with their father, who they knew as an often absent, sometimes irritable, but fundamentally familiar figure. Within days, reporters had identified the Miller family's home and had begun calling the residents and approaching neighbors for comments. Paula refused all interview requests. Neighbors later reported that the Miller family became increasingly isolated, with Paula and the children rarely leaving the house except for necessary errands. Other children in the neighborhood, informed by their parents about Miller's arrest, began to avoid or taunt the Miller children. The criminal proceedings against Richard Miller were complex and would eventually involve multiple trials. The first trial began in March 1985, approximately 5 months after Miller's arrest. The prosecution was handled by Assistant U.S. Attorneys Russell Heyman and Richard Kendall, who presented evidence of Miller's relationship with Svetlana Ogorodnikova, his provision of classified information, his meetings with the Ogorodnikovs to discuss espionage arrangements, and his trip to San Francisco for the planned meeting with Soviet intelligence officers. The evidence included surveillance photographs showing Miller and Svetlana together at various locations, wiretap recordings of telephone conversations in which Miller and Svetlana discussed plans for meetings and for providing information, testimony from FBI agents who had investigated Miller and who described the classified materials he had accessed, documents that Miller had photocopied and provided to the Ogorodnikovs, which were recovered during searches, financial, records showing unexplained deposits to the Ogorodnikovs' accounts that prosecutors argued represented payment from Soviet intelligence, and testimony from Svetlana Ogorodnikova, who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Svetlana's testimony was particularly damaging to Miller. She described in detail how she had been instructed by her husband, who was in contact with Soviet intelligence officers, to cultivate a relationship with Miller. She acknowledged that she had engaged in a sexual relationship with Miller as part of this cultivation. She testified that Miller had been eager to provide information in exchange for money, and that he had understood that this information would be provided to Soviet intelligence. Miller's defense strategy was based on his claim that he had been conducting an unauthorized but well-intentioned counterintelligence operation. His attorney, Joel Levine, argued that Miller had been trying to infiltrate a Soviet intelligence operation, and that his relationship with Svetlana and his provision of information had been part of this effort. The defense acknowledged that Miller had violated FBI procedures by not reporting his activities to supervisors, but argued that he had not had treasonous intent and had not actually intended to damage U.S. national security. This defense faced a fundamental problem. Miller offered no credible explanation for why he had never reported his activities to any supervisor or colleague, a requirement he well knew. Miller's acceptance of money, or his expectation of payment, was inconsistent with a legitimate counterintelligence operation. The specific classified information that Miller had provided included materials that could directly endanger FBI operations and confidential informants, information that no agent conducting a legitimate operation would ever actually provide to foreign intelligence, even as part of a false flag operation. The first trial lasted approximately 7 weeks. The jury deliberated for several days before announcing that they were deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial on June 19, 1985. The jury had been split, with some jurors believing Miller's claim that he had been attempting a counterintelligence operation, while others believing that he had been genuinely spying for money. A second trial also ended in a deadlocked jury and a mistrial, declared in November 1985. The third trial began in May 1986. By this time, prosecutors had spent months analyzing why the first 2 juries had been unable to reach verdicts. They concluded that Miller's claim of conducting a counterintelligence operation, however implausible to investigators and FBI professionals, had created sufficient doubt among some jurors. For the third trial, prosecutors focused heavily on demonstrating that Miller's claimed counterintelligence operation made no sense given FBI procedures, that his specific actions were inconsistent with any legitimate operation, and that his acceptance of money and his efforts to conceal his activities proved his treasonous intent. The prosecution also benefited from changes in the composition and testimony of witnesses. Nikolay Ogorodnikov, who had been convicted on espionage-related charges in a separate trial and had been sentenced to prison, agreed to testify against Miller in exchange for a reduction in his sentence. Nikolay testified that Miller had been fully aware that the information he was providing would go to Soviet intelligence, and that Miller had been motivated primarily by money rather than by any counterintelligence purpose. The third trial lasted approximately 8 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict on June 19, 1986. Richard Miller was found guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage, of unauthorized communication of national defense information, and of solicitation of a bribe. The verdict was read in a packed courtroom with reporters present from national news organizations. According to witnesses, Miller showed little emotion when the verdict was announced. Paula Miller, who had attended portions of all 3 trials, began crying when the guilty verdicts were read. Miller was remanded to custody immediately. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for several months later. Prosecutors argued for a lengthy sentence, potentially life in prison, arguing that Miller had committed one of the most serious violations of trust possible for a law enforcement officer, and that his actions had compromised national security and endangered FBI operations and personnel. Defense attorneys argued for leniency, emphasizing that Miller had not received any actual payment from Soviet intelligence, that the information he had disclosed had not resulted in any specific known damage, and that Miller's personal and professional failures suggested mental health issues and poor judgment rather than malicious intent. Judge David Kenyon sentenced Richard Miller to 2 consecutive life terms plus 50 years in federal prison. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Kenyon stated that Miller had betrayed the FBI, had betrayed his country, and had placed at risk the lives of individuals who were working as confidential informants for the United States. The judge acknowledged that Miller had not been a sophisticated spy and had not received significant financial benefit, but emphasized that the potential damage from his actions was enormous and that the sentence needed to reflect the seriousness of an FBI agent committing espionage. Miller's conviction and sentence were appealed. His attorneys argued that errors during the trials had prejudiced the jury and that the sentence was excessive. In 1989, an appellate court overturned Miller's conviction on technical grounds related to jury instructions, finding that the judge in the third trial had not properly instructed the jury regarding what constituted national defense information. Under the espionage statutes, the appellate court ordered a new trial. The fourth trial took place in late 1990. By this time, more than 6 years had passed since Miller's initial arrest. The evidence presented was similar to previous trials, though some witnesses had died or were no longer available. The jury returned a guilty verdict on October 9, 1990, convicting Miller on 6 counts of espionage-related offenses. In February 1991, Miller was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a significantly shorter sentence than his original 2 life terms, but still a substantial period of incarceration. Miller served his sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Tucson, Arizona. According to Bureau of Prisons records, his conduct during imprisonment was generally satisfactory. He participated in prison education programs and worked in the prison library. He maintained contact with some family members through letters, though visits were infrequent due to the distance between the prison and Los Angeles, where his family lived. Svetlana Ogorodnikova had pled guilty to espionage-related charges in 1985 and had been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison in exchange for her testimony against Miller. Her sentence was dramatically reduced due to her extensive cooperation with prosecutors and testimony. She was released in 1994 after serving approximately 18 months and was deported to Russia, which had by that time replaced the Soviet Union following the USSR's dissolution in 1991. Nikolay Ogorodnikov had been convicted on espionage charges and sentenced to prison. He was released after serving his sentence and was also deported to Russia. According to later reports, both Svetlana and Nikolay Ogorodnikov settled in Moscow, though their subsequent lives are not well documented. There is no evidence that either of them received any recognition or reward from Russian intelligence services for their role in the Miller case. Indeed, given that the operation had been exposed and had resulted in their arrests and deportations, they were likely viewed as failures rather than successes. The impact of the case on the Miller family was profound and lasting. Paula Miller divorced Richard in 1987 while he was imprisoned awaiting his appeal. Court records indicate that the divorce was uncontested. Paula received custody of all 4 children and was granted the family home, though she sold it shortly thereafter and moved with the children to a smaller residence in a different part of Los Angeles to escape the notoriety associated with the case. The Miller children faced years of difficulties stemming from their father's crimes. The oldest child had been a teenager when the father was arrested. According to later accounts, this child struggled with anger and shame regarding the father's actions, graduated from high school but did not attend college immediately, and instead worked a series of jobs while trying to process what had happened to the family. One of the children eventually joined the U.S. Army, later stating that part of the motivation for military service was to demonstrate loyalty to the United States despite the father's betrayal. Another child, who had been in middle school at the time of the arrest, experienced severe social difficulties during high school. According to accounts from teachers and counselors, this child was frequently the target of bullying related to the father's espionage conviction. Academic performance, which had been strong before the arrest, declined significantly. This child eventually graduated from high school but moved away from Los Angeles shortly afterward, seeking to establish a life separate from the family's history. The 2 youngest children, who had been in elementary school when their father was arrested, had limited understanding of what their father had done at the time. As they grew older and learned more about espionage and national security, they came to understand the full significance of his actions. All the children struggled with their identity and with reconciling their memories of their father as a sometimes present but recognizable figure, with the public narrative of him as a traitor. Richard Miller was released from federal prison on May 16, 2002, after serving approximately 13 years of his 20-year sentence, receiving credit for good behavior and time served. He was 65 years old. Upon his release, he moved to Utah, where he had family connections. He took a job doing data entry for a small business, work that required no security clearance and that paid modestly. Miller's relationship with his children remained strained. According to available information, some of his children maintained occasional contact with him, while others chose to have no relationship. Paula, his ex-wife, refused all contact and declined to discuss him. Miller lived quietly for the remainder of his life, avoiding publicity and declining interview requests. According to public records, Richard William Miller died several years after his release from prison. He lived his final years in obscurity, having lost his career, his family, and his reputation. The damage assessment conducted by the FBI in the aftermath of Miller's arrest and conviction concluded that while Miller had provided classified information to Soviet intelligence, the actual damage to U.S. national security was less than it might have been. Miller's espionage had been discovered quickly. Only approximately 2.5 months elapsed between his recruitment in July 1984 and his arrest in October 1984, limiting the volume of information he was able to provide. Some of the information Miller provided was either outdated or was information the FBI believed Soviet intelligence likely already possessed through other sources. The FBI was able to implement immediate countermeasures once Miller was arrested. Confidential informants whose identities may have been compromised were notified and were either relocated or their relationships with the FBI were terminated. Surveillance operations that may have been revealed were modified or ended. However, the damage assessment also noted areas of significant harm that were difficult to quantify. The exposure of FBI surveillance techniques and technologies meant that Soviet intelligence could develop countermeasures, potentially allowing their officers to evade detection in the future. The identification of confidential informants, even if those individuals were notified and protected, created a chilling effect that made it more difficult to recruit new informants who might fear that their identities would not be adequately protected. Most significantly, the fact that an FBI agent had committed espionage damaged the Bureau's reputation both domestically and internationally, raising questions about the FBI's internal security procedures and its ability to protect classified information. The Miller case led to a comprehensive review of FBI internal security procedures. The review identified several systemic weaknesses that had allowed Miller's espionage to occur and to continue for several months before detection. Insufficient monitoring of employee behavior and performance meant that Miller's obvious problems, his poor work performance, his financial difficulties, his personal appearance issues, had been documented by supervisors but had not triggered more aggressive intervention or a security clearance review. Inadequate control of classified materials had allowed Miller to access, photocopy, and remove classified documents from FBI facilities without any effective monitoring or oversight. The Bureau at that time did not conduct regular polygraph examinations of employees with access to classified information, unlike some other intelligence agencies. There was also insufficient training on recognizing and reporting security concerns, which meant that several FBI employees had observed aspects of Miller's suspicious behavior but had not reported it through proper channels or had not recognized the significance of what they were observing. Following these findings, the FBI implemented a range of reforms designed to strengthen internal security. These included more rigorous background checks for employees, regular polygraph examinations for personnel with access to sensitive information, enhanced physical security measures at FBI facilities, improved procedures for monitoring access to classified materials, and more comprehensive training for supervisors on recognizing and responding to employee security concerns. The Miller case also had implications for how the FBI approached counterintelligence investigations of American citizens suspected of espionage. The case demonstrated that even individuals who appear incompetent or unlikely candidates for espionage can be recruited by foreign intelligence services and can cause significant damage. It reinforced the importance of not making assumptions about who might be vulnerable to recruitment, and of taking seriously even preliminary indicators of potential security problems. For the intelligence community more broadly, the Miller case served as a cautionary tale about the human vulnerabilities that can be exploited by foreign intelligence services. Miller had been recruited not through sophisticated ideological manipulation, but through relatively straightforward exploitation of personal weaknesses. His ego, his unhappiness, his financial problems, his susceptibility to a sexual relationship. The case illustrated that personnel security is not primarily about preventing sophisticated adversaries from penetrating security systems, but about identifying and addressing the personal vulnerabilities that make individuals susceptible to recruitment. The question of responsibility in the Miller case is complicated because it requires assigning blame within a system where everyone was acting according to institutional logic and where those most harmed had the least agency. Richard Miller bore primary responsibility for his decision to commit espionage. He made conscious choices to engage in an affair with a subject of investigation, to provide classified information, to accept the prospect of payment, and to conceal his activities from supervisors. These were deliberate acts of betrayal for which he was appropriately held legally accountable. But Miller's actions occurred within a context of FBI management failures. His supervisors had documented his poor performance for years, but had taken no effective action to address it. His assignment to foreign counterintelligence, despite his obvious limitations, represented a failure of personnel management. The FBI's internal security procedures that allowed him to access and remove classified materials without detection represented systemic weaknesses that made his espionage possible. Svetlana and Nikolay Ogorodnikov bore responsibility for their roles. as agents of Soviet intelligence, actively working to recruit an American official and to facilitate espionage. They exploited Miller's vulnerabilities deliberately and for the benefit of a foreign power. Soviet intelligence officers who directed the Ogorodnikovs and who sought to recruit Miller bore responsibility for an operation that violated American law and that sought to compromise U.S. national security. They were operating according to the logic of Cold War intelligence competition, but this context does not eliminate their moral responsibility for actions designed to harm American interests and to exploit individual vulnerabilities. The Miller children bore no responsibility for any of this. They were innocent victims of their father's choices, of an intelligence operation they knew nothing about, and of a Cold War system that treated people as assets to be recruited, surveilled, arrested, and imprisoned. They suffered consequences they did not deserve: social stigma, family, dissolution, trauma, and years of struggling to understand why their father had done what he did. Paula Miller bore no responsibility for her husband's espionage and was not charged with any crime, yet she bore enormous consequences. She dealt with the public exposure of her husband's affair, the revelation of his espionage, the financial hardship of supporting 4 children alone, the social stigma associated with being married to a convicted spy, and the challenge of explaining to her children why their father was in prison and why other people regarded their family with suspicion or contempt. The larger question raised by the Miller case is how institutions can balance efficiency with security, how organizations can identify and address employee problems before those problems become security threats, and what responsibility institutions bear when systemic weaknesses enable individual failures. The FBI, after Miller's conviction, acknowledged that internal security procedures had been inadequate and implemented reforms, but these reforms came after the damage had been done, after Miller had provided classified information to Soviet intelligence, and after a family had been destroyed. There is also the question of what the Miller case reveals about the nature of espionage during the Cold War. The popular imagination often envisions spies as sophisticated operators engaged in elaborate schemes involving high technology and international intrigue. The Miller case presents a different and perhaps more unsettling picture. A mediocre FBI agent having an affair with a Soviet emigre woman, photocopying documents to provide to her husband to deliver to contacts at a consulate, motivated by a combination of ego, desperation, and hope for financial payment. The banality of it, the restaurants where planning occurred, the hotel in San Francisco, the confused rationalizations, makes it no less serious as a betrayal, but it strips away any romantic notions of espionage as a glamorous or noble activity. Richard Miller was 47 years old when he was arrested carrying classified documents in his briefcase. He was 65 when he was released from prison, having lost everything: his career, his marriage, his relationship with his children, his reputation, his freedom. He lived his remaining years in obscurity, having destroyed his family for a Soviet operation that was exposed within weeks, for money he never received, for a woman who testified against him, for rationalizations that no one believed, including, eventually, himself. The photograph that FBI surveillance took of Miller and Svetlana Ogorodnikova in a Los Angeles restaurant in August 1984 captured what made his case most unsettling: the ordinariness of it. In the image, Miller looks like any middle-aged man having lunch. There is nothing that suggests espionage or betrayal, and perhaps that was the most disturbing truth the case revealed, that one of the most significant security breaches in FBI history began not with sophisticated tradecraft, but with a lonely, unsuccessful agent who convinced himself that his betrayal was somehow something other than what it obviously was.